All right, what's up, world? Welcome back again to the Remix Morning Show here in Black Power Media. Again, I'm Jared Ball. Very happy to in this segment play host to our next guest, a very special guest, an old friend of mine, Dr. Khadijah Ali-Coleman, who, among many other things, is a writer, scholar, performing artist, and co-founder of Black Family Homeschool Educators and Scholars, and who is here to talk with us about that work and some new work and some other things. So, Dr. Coleman, Ali-Coleman, welcome. It's good to see you again. Welcome. Good
It
morning.
it is so good to see you. We go way back. We go way back.
Way back, and you have done big things.
Let me tell you something. You probably don't
Uh-oh.
realize that when I used to do the news, when you were on a DC radio station, independent radio station, right? I was homeschooling.
WPFW, we give them shout outs
Okay,
all the
okay,
time.
good.
WPFW 89.3 FM. Shout out to
That's
Katia
right.
Stitt and all the good people over there. Absolutely. Yes,
That's
yes,
right.
yes,
Because
indeed.
you never know. So I've
You
done
never know. Right, right. Radio rules. Sometimes we
right.
bring radio rules into the YouTube, but yeah, it's all good over here. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, when I was at WPFW, and that was over 13 or 14 years ago. I was homeschooling then. And so I was bringing my daughter with me to the station when I was doing the news with Askia and Muhammad before your show. So I just think that this is just so kismet and synchronicity at work that now we're talking about, this right now, because when all the time that I've known you, off and on, I've been homeschooling my daughter.
Wow. And shout out to Askia Muhammad too, by the way,
Yeah.
raising his name up. But and my brother Jamil, who does radio with him now in the morning, anyway, but uh now that you say so all those years I was and am still dealing with the personal contradiction that I admittedly struggle with internally a great deal with the schooling of our children,
Yeah.
most of which has occurred in the public school system.
Mm-hmm.
And I am not, I just wanted just a quick disclaimer to all those who might see this. I am not inviting critique or commentary on that, on my personal situation. I'm just sharing that to say that it is a contradiction for me.
Mm-hmm.
And homeschooling was something that I remember we looked into, and our situation at the time didn't present an alternative or an option that worked for us. But it's something that I've been very much interested in learning more about, or just following. And
Mm-hmm.
so on the one hand, I want to ask you, so my first real question was, what is the relationship between the Black tradition of homeschooling and the Black independence school tradition? And is there, could we start with a little bit of that, and then tell us about your work and why homeschooling you think is so important?
Well, that's an awesome question, and just to let me wrap my mind around it, and to be transparent, I actually attended a Pan African independent school in Washington D.C., Nation House Watoto Shule, back in the '80s, very
Oh,
early when
wow.
it started, and very briefly, but my parents, my mother, in particular, had a she's passed, but she had a very Pan African mindset, and so that was my early experience. I became familiar with homeschooling when she began homeschooling my brother, who's 11 years younger than me. So I was an adult, and he was either middle school or early high school, and so that being even a possibility and entering my consciousness for me, I would say that was maybe the 90s. And so when I decided to become a researcher and to look particularly at African American homeschool dual enrolled students, through my doctoral program at Morgan State University, with emphasis on community college leadership, I was expected and had to, for my literature review, really look at the history of homeschooling in particular, to Black families. And what I found is that the literature, there's really, it's absent of looking at homeschooling from the perspective, from a historical framework, right? But also from looking at the voices, hearing the voices of Black homeschooling, homeschooled children, those who were formerly homeschooled, currently in the world of work, or entrepreneurs, college, what have you. And so it's really this deficit of literature in the research world. And so a lot of my research had to come from those who hadn't been interviewed by the news or hadn't written books or hadn't been part of a study, to really find out what is this homeschooling culture in reference to Black people, right? And so a lot of the anecdotal stories that I came across is that for the most part, it's been considered fringe. And when you think of homeschooling, is usually synonymous with white, cultish, conservative families. But it really came about, popularized during the rise of these independent Black schools that we know really came about late 60s, 70s, late 70s. And a lot of these parents did not want to have attention brought to their practice for fear that there would be some type of retribution or something to stop them from being able to homeschool and to school their children at home. And so you saw maybe in the early 90s, folks starting to write about it. One really prominent Black homeschooler, Paula Penn Nabrit, has a book out. The name escapes me, but you can, if for those folks listening, can Google her name. And actually, my colleague, Dr. Cheryl Field Smith, who is the co-founder of Black Family Homeschool Educators and Scholars with Me, recently interviewed her. And so, contemporary perspectives on Black homeschooling. But what she talks about is that when she chose to homeschool, it wasn't really this community that exists now, and it was really it was about survival and being confronted with so many deficiencies and overt racism in the public school system, that homeschooling was really it wasn't something they set out to do. It was something they had to do. And she talks about how her children didn't want to be, now we have these communities of homeschooling. The children seem so gleefully joyful to be outside of these traditional school settings. But she was saying at the time, her kids didn't want to be homeschooled. And she puts that in her book. They weren't like, yeah, mama, homeschool me. But she and her husband knew that this was something they had to do, because she was witnessing the destruction of the attempt to destroy her children's love of learning. And she talked about in this interview with Cheryl about it's this system of white supremacy, but it's also what she coined, and I love this in the interview. She coined the colored I think it was colored conspirators or something similar to that. But understanding that in our school system, a lot of us who are choosing to homeschool, it's this system, and it can be brought on with someone with a brown or white face. It's really not at nowadays. And I can say it with my own story. My daughter, I knew fourth grade, because she had been in and out of the school system. Because for me, it was, do I like this school? If not, she's coming home and I'm going to teach her. But fourth grade, this teacher asked for me to come in, and she wanted to talk with me. And she was telling me that I had to have a conversation with my daughter, because she would finish her work before everyone else. And then she would pull out a journal and start writing. And she felt that this was a disruption to the other children, because they wanted to write as well. And it was that moment where I said, this is the dumbest SHIT that I have ever heard in my life. And this is not what I want for my daughter. And so, and when you talk to parents, there are those kinds of stories where it's this, if it's not naturally intuitive, they're the red flags that they can recount, off the top of their head, where it was that moment that they knew that this was not the space for their children.
So you sort of touched on it already, but one of the things I wanted to ask also, about the negative stereotypes associated with homeschooling, and then I'm very happy to have you explode those myths, particularly as they pertain to Black children. But some of them that we hear, how, first of all, how can we do it? How do we homeschool when we have to work, or we can't afford it, or how do we, or the kids don't get the quality education that they would get in an actual school, or what about their ability to become quote unquote successful in this society? What Yeah, and maybe if there are other prominent myths that you all have to deal with on a regular basis, you could bring them up and as Bob Brown says, shotgun them,
That's right.
shotgun those ideas and those myths. But yeah,
Well, I
what
would
do you
tell
you've
you
seen? Yeah.
on this whole I call it the speaking junket, right? So because homeschooling is real popular now because of COVID, right? And let's be
Mm.
real. And it's so funny because when I was doing in my program, my advisors and folks were like, this woman is tripping. Folks already think I'm crazy, so like, what in the hell is she talking about homeschooling? And I literally had to defend my dissertation when the week that quarantine began last year, right?
Mm.
And so
You
then
started off by saying, "I told you."
right,
Was that your
right,
first line? Hi, everybody. Good morning. I told you.
well, that
Because
the
that's how I
thing,
started my defense, by the
right.
way.
But the thing is that I didn't have time to say I told you because I was so busy creating these communities, right? But
Mm.
the thing that really boggles my mind, this first myth that I want to dispel, is that for many, they didn't even know that Black people homeschooled until COVID-19, right? When the school started tripping, and they're like, oh hell no. Because for many parents, what they started to realize was this dynamic between their children and the teachers because of virtual learning. And so when the classroom now was on the computer screen, and the parents could hear how teachers were talking to their children, for many they were like, oh no, this will not go, right? So that's the first myth, is that Black people have been homeschooling for decades, right? It's not new. I mentioned that before, and I encourage people to really understand that, because what for those who are homeschooling because of COVID-19, they are believing that they are creating a new culture when there is a culture that exists. And I will tell you that many are trying to, because it's now an ecosystem that exists for homeschooling, because so many Black people have begun to homeschool. The US Census released a recent study at the top of this year, looking at 2020, and saying that homeschooling among Black families has now jumped to 16%. And that's a 500% increase when we realize that the data that we had said that Black families were really only 3 to 5% of homeschooling families. And I can say that when I conducted my study in 2019, that's really what the data said. And that's kind of sketchy in itself, because there are no consistent statewide policy on record keeping when it comes to homeschooling families, because the
Mm.
policy is so disparate across the United States. I'm in Maryland now. I can go to Georgia and have a completely different policy in place regarding homeschooling, right? And so the data that we have is sketchy to begin with, but before 2020, it was 3 to 5%. Now it's 16%, and only growing, right? So that's the first myth. Black people been homeschooling. It's not new. So don't try to come up in the culture and try to now say, to set standards, and particularly to try to replicate a traditional schooling environment. And that is probably the second myth, is that when folks are homeschooling, that's not what we're trying to do for the most part, is replicate what it is that you find in these traditional school spaces. And when I say traditional school spaces, I'm talking about private, public, charter schools, right? And folks homeschool differently, depending on what the unique challenges or dynamic of their family is. Was parenting one child, right? And so and I had a gig lifestyle, meaning that I was adjunct professor. I had writing gigs and things like that. So I took her on field trips. I took her on shoots with me. I have an arts organization. She was technical staff. So there were certain things that she did because it was specific to the lifestyle of our family. For other families, it may look completely different. Another myth is that homeschooling is virtual learning and that they're synonymous. And that is a damn lie. That is not the truth. Some families may include virtual learning within their curriculum, but they are not synonymous. And so for someone to say, my child's at home and they on the computer, they're at a virtual school, I'm homeschooling, that is not homeschooling. And being part of a virtual school, not the same thing, right? Also, homeschooling, you hear a lot of people talking about it, is about privilege, right? That only privileged people can do it. My colleague, Dr. Cheryl Field Smith, has a book out specifically on single Black mothers who are homeschooling. And some of the members of the cohort that she studied were on welfare. Some were working in addition to homeschooling. So the dynamic and this idea of what a homeschooling parent or a homeschooling family looks like has really been shot out of the water with believing that it's a two-parent home or that it's an upper middle class or wealthy household. I know I was not wealthy. I am not wealthy now, and I homeschooled off and on for 13 years. And my daughter now is currently, I graduated her from our homeschool this past May, and I homeschooled her completely through high school and off and on through elementary. But we homeschooled completely through high school, and she was earning her associate's degree while she was in high school. So she graduated with an associate's, and so she's now at the University of San Francisco, and she has full ride, right? But that was largely because she was accruing credits.
So it can be. So Dr. Ali-Coleman, I'm sorry, we have to wrap it here.
Okay.
So one, I want to invite people to follow up with your work at blackfamilyhomeschool.org. And then to also know we're going to have you back somewhere on this platform, my show, back on the Remix somewhere. We have to have more of this conversation. But I wanted to just thank you very much for coming through at least a little bit and breaking down some of these myths. And we'll invite people to check out more of your work there. And again, like I said, we'll have to have you back to discuss this some more. Because there's so much more to get into.
It's so much. You can see I run my mouth. But thank you so much for having me. And I love talking about homeschooling. And I just love talking about the things that Black families are doing. So thank you for having me.
Anytime. And thank you for doing that work. And we'll be back in touch. It's always good to see you, Dr. Khadijah Ali-Coleman, blackfamilyhomeschool.org. And we will keep it moving here at the Remix Morning Show, Black Power Media. Thanks, everybody. Let's get back to it. Peace.